12th of February, 6th Sunday in Ordinary Time. Sermon on Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 to 37, Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 15 to 20, and Psalm 119, verses 1 to 8. When the Lord brought the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, it was for the purpose of shaping them into a nation, the nation into which ultimately the Messiah of the whole world would be born. In order for that to be successful, it was essential that the people remained together, that they didn't become drawn into involvement with the pagan nations surrounding them, and that they stayed faithful in their worship of the Lord. They had to be identifiable as God's holy nation. For that purpose they were given a law. The law was based on 10 commandments written by God on tablets of stone and given to Moses. Besides these, there were in total 613 regulations, rules and directives. 365 were negative and 248 were positive. These addressed almost every aspect of life, including health and safety, food laws, care of the poor, responsibility towards animals, law and order, and most of all, worship. Some of the rules, namely circumcision, Sabbath keeping and dietary restrictions, became Jewish distinctives, jealously guarded and a source of pride to the devout. We see a glimpse of this in Psalm 119. The writer of this psalm clearly loved the law. He wrote the longest psalm in the Bible, 176 verses of it, and it seems that once he began writing about the law, he just couldn't stop. The psalmist saw abundant blessings in keeping the law, and it was clearly tightly bound into his worship of God. The final verse of our short reading from this psalm, verse 8 though, sounds a note of doubt from the writer, a plea that he would not be utterly forsaken, even though he kept the Lord's decrees. And could anyone really keep perfectly all those rules? However, the law was given. During the journey through the wilderness towards the promised land, many of the laws were indeed broken. So much so that the journey, which should have taken not much more than a month, took 40 years, during which almost all those who had left Egypt with Moses eventually died. It was their children who succeeded in entering the land that was to be theirs. The people had neglected God's law seriously, losing faith at the smallest setback, turning to idolatry, questioning authority, indulging in revelry. Many had been struck down by God, but the remainder had been forced to wander the desert until all had died. Of the multitude that had escaped from Egypt, only Joshua and Caleb finally reached the promised land. It is therefore sobering to read the pleading words of Moses to the assembled people shortly before he died, and Joshua took over the leadership, ready to enter the land. Moses knew how the people had failed. He knew how close the nation had been to vanishing among the pagan nations. He must have been aware that the law could not make anyone perfect, but that it was the best hope of keeping them together and faithful to God. And so he warned the people that they had a life and death choice ahead of them, life and prosperity, or death and destruction. In order to succeed as a nation, they must obey God's commandments, make them the foundation of their lives by walking in his ways, and above all, they must love him. If they did so, their new land would be blessed with prosperity. They would have long life and would increase as a people, becoming firmly established. It would be like an earthly expression of God's kingdom. The obverse, however, would be if they turned away, forsaking the Lord and serving other gods. Then they would suffer destruction. From these words we can see God's intent towards his people. He wanted them to prosper, to draw close to him and truly be his, in fulfillment of the promises he had made long before to Abraham. His laws were not there to spoil people's enjoyment, quite the reverse. They were, however, to be taken seriously. Over the succeeding centuries, the nation of Israel failed many times to live up to God's standards. At one point, God even had the nation deported into Assyria and Babylon for a generation, in order to bring them back in line. By the time Jesus began his ministry, the law had almost run its course, its purpose ready to be fulfilled, for here was the Messiah as promised. Of course, the principles of the law, love and faithfulness for God, care for others, morality and honesty, would remain, though they would be subsumed into Jesus' 2 commandments, to love God and to love others as we love ourselves. The entire law hung on those 2. During Jesus' life on earth, though, the law still stood, and Jesus had not come to remove, but to fulfill its meaning and purpose. In his teaching from our Gospel passage today, he is addressing 2 of the 10 commandments concerning murder and adultery. However, he is setting the bar much higher than the original commandments implied. There would have been many Jews listening to Jesus who had never committed either murder or adultery, and most, if not all of us, are also innocent of such acts. Those are 2 commandments that are clear and easy for any normal person to keep faithfully. What Jesus says, however, is challenging. Never mind feeling virtuous because you've never murdered anyone, he says. What about the times you're angry with a brother, a fellow believer? That is just as culpable. Never mind being proud because of not having committed adultery. What if you've allowed lustful thoughts to dominate your mind? That's just as bad. Few Jews of Jesus' day would pass a test like that, and nor would most of us. Anger often breaks forth. In modern times it's almost a feature of daily life, taking the form of road rage, which does indeed sometimes lead to murder, online abuse that can drive someone to suicide, inability to discuss calmly, feelings of entitlement that cause us to explode if service disappoints us or friends let us down. Immoral thoughts can also plague many individuals, and no doubt they're often caused by what's too readily available on the internet. They're clearly age-old problems, internet or not though, and that ultimately they are human failures. Christians, and no doubt the Jews of Jesus' day, often tick off the 10 commandments as if they're easily achievable. I remember doing that myself as I walked home from Sunday school with a friend. But we couldn't have ticked off the equivalent list that Jesus had compiled. Evidently, Jesus had no intention of treating human sin lightly. He makes it abundantly clear that sin, all sin, is serious. He had, after all, come to deal with sin in the most self-sacrificing way. A passage such as this could leave anyone in despair. How can we possibly be good enough for God? We mustn't be complacent, and we must keep our standards high. But if we fail, what then? The penalties that Jesus set out in his teaching are just. No one could appeal against them. But in Christ we have an advocate for if and when we fail. To bring honour to our God, we must shun sin as far as possible. But we have a safety net, for there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ. That is the good news of the gospel that sets us free, finally, from the law of sin and death.